The morning sun cast long shadows across the Wyoming Territory as Grayson Blackwood stood on his porch, steam rising from his coffee cup. His weathered hands, calloused from years of ranch work, gripped the mug while his sharp eyes scanned the horizon. Most folks around these parts knew him as the quiet rancher who kept to himself, tending his prized cattle and maintaining his modest spread with meticulous care. What they didn't know was that those same hands that now guided horse reins and mended fences had once guided something far more lethal. Those eyes that watched for stray cattle had once watched through a rifle scope with such deadly accuracy that men whispered the name Deadeye with equal parts fear and respect. But that was a lifetime ago. Now Grayson found peace in the simple rhythm of ranch life. The soft nickering of horses in the stable, the gentle lowing of cattle in the morning mist, and the quiet solitude that surrounded his isolated piece of heaven were all he needed. His nearest neighbors were miles away, just the way he preferred it. Each day followed a familiar pattern that brought him comfort. He'd rise before dawn, check the fences, tend to his horses, and ensure his cattle were safe. The local folks who occasionally passed by his ranch might see him working, offer a friendly wave, and receive a polite nod in return. They saw nothing remarkable about him, just another hard-working rancher trying to carve out a living in the untamed West. His past remained carefully hidden, locked away like the custom Sharps rifle that lay wrapped in waxed cloth beneath his bed. The stories of his time as an Army scout, the legendary shots that had earned him his nickname, the missions that had shaped him, these were memories he preferred to leave undisturbed, like the dust collecting on his old military uniform. But fate has a way of disturbing even the most peaceful of lives. As Grayson stood there that morning, savoring his coffee and the tranquility of his ranch, he couldn't know that two men were about to shatter his carefully constructed peace. Men who would mistake his quiet nature for weakness, his solitude for vulnerability, and his peaceful demeanor for cowardice. They would learn, as others had before them, that still waters run deep, and that sometimes the quietest men have the deadliest aim. Before we continue this incredible story, tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Have you ever known someone who seemed quiet and unassuming, but turned out to be extraordinary? Your stories might be featured in our next video. The late afternoon sun cast an ominous glow across the trail as two riders approached the outskirts of Grayson's ranch. Wyatt Snake Thorne and Jasper Raven Kane were men whose reputations preceded them like dark clouds before a storm. Snake, lean and coiled with tension, his eyes cold as winter frost, rode slightly ahead of his partner. Raven, broader and darker, with a face marked by an old knife scar, followed close behind, his hand never far from his gun. They'd been watching Grayson's ranch for days, studying the routine of the quiet rancher who lived alone. Their reputation for ruthless efficiency had spread across 3 territories, leaving a trail of empty corrals and grieving ranchers in their wake. No witnesses ever remained to testify against them. They made sure of that. "Look at him," Snake sneered, watching through his brass spyglass as Grayson methodically repaired a fence line in the distance. "Man's soft as summer butter. Probably never held anything more dangerous than a dinner knife." Raven chuckled darkly, the sound like gravel under boot heels. "Saw him in town yesterday," Raven added, adjusting his worn black hat. "Someone bumped into him at the general store and he just stepped aside, apologized even. No spine in him." He spat into the dust. "His cattle will fetch a fine price down in Mexico. Finest Herefords I've seen in months." The two rustlers had planned this carefully, as they always did. They'd observed how Grayson worked alone, how he seemed to avoid confrontation at all costs. They'd noted the lack of hands on his ranch, the isolation of his property, the predictability of his schedule. To them, he was just another soft target, another weak man who'd soon learn the hard way that the West belonged to the strong. "Tomorrow night," Snake decided, collapsing his spyglass with a sharp click. "New moon. We'll take the whole herd. Might even leave him a little message. Burn that nice barn of his." Show folks what happens when they settle in our territory." His thin lips curved into a cruel smile. "Unless he wants to try stopping us." They both laughed at that, the sound echoing across the empty prairie. The idea of the quiet rancher standing up to them seemed absurd. They'd faced down posses, outsmarted marshals, and broken stronger men than him. What could one peaceful rancher do against two hardened outlaws? As they turned their horses to ride back to their camp, neither man noticed how Grayson's movements had become more deliberate, how his eyes had tracked their position on the ridge, how his posture had shifted ever so slightly from that of a simple rancher to something altogether more dangerous. They didn't see the way his hand had instinctively moved to his hip, where a gun might have rested in days long past. They were about to learn what so many others had discovered too late, that appearances can be deceiving, and that sometimes the deadliest predator is the one that doesn't bare its teeth until the perfect moment. The sun sank lower on the horizon, casting long shadows across the land as Snake and Raven rode away, confident in their plan, unaware that they were riding straight toward a confrontation that would become the stuff of legend. The night settled over Grayson's ranch like a thick wool blanket, bringing with it a stillness that only those who lived on the frontier truly understood. But tonight, that stillness carried an edge, a tension that made the horses in the barn shift restlessly in their stalls. Even the crickets seemed to sense it, their usual chorus muted and sporadic. Grayson sat in the darkness of his porch, invisible to anyone watching. His coffee had gone cold, untouched in his hand. To most, he might have appeared to be simply enjoying the evening air, but his posture told a different story. His breathing was measured, controlled, and his eyes, adapted to the darkness, caught every shadow's movement. The sound came first, the soft crunch of boots trying too hard to be quiet, the muffled clink of spurs wrapped in cloth. Snake and Raven thought they were being clever, approaching from different directions, using the cover of darkness to mask their movements. But to Grayson's trained ears, they might as well have been marching with a brass band. He waited perfectly still as they approached his fence line. The metallic snick of wire cutters broke the silence, followed by a whispered curse as the tool slipped. That's when Grayson moved, his steps so quiet that the rustlers didn't notice him until his voice cut through the darkness. "Those are good fences," he said softly, his tone conversational. "It will take me 3 days to put them up." Snake and Raven spun around, hands instinctively dropping to their gun belts. They found Grayson standing there, empty hands clearly visible, looking more like he was about to discuss the weather than confront two armed men. "Well, if it ain't the peaceful rancher himself," Snake sneered, recovering from his surprise. "Out for a midnight stroll?" His hand remained near his pistol, fingers twitching slightly. Grayson's voice remained calm, almost gentle. "You boys might want to reconsider what you're doing here. There are easier ranches to raid, ones that won't push back quite so hard." There was something in his tone, a quiet certainty that made Raven shift uncomfortably, though Snake seemed too angry to notice. "Is that a threat, old man?" Snake took a step forward, moonlight glinting off his gun belt. "Because from where I'm standing, you're outnumbered and unarmed. Mighty bold words for a man in your position." A ghost of a smile crossed Grayson's face, gone so quickly they might have imagined it. "Not a threat, just some friendly advice. Walk away now and we can pretend this never happened." Raven's laugh was forced, hiding his unease. "Listen to him, Snake, trying to sound tough while he's shaking in his boots." But Snake had already drawn his gun, pointing it at Grayson's chest. "Maybe we should teach him what happens to folks who try to tell us what to do." What happened next was so fast that later, neither rustler could quite describe it. Somehow, Grayson was no longer where he had been standing. Snake's gun went flying, his wrist aching from a grip he never saw coming. Raven found himself staring down the length of his own pistol, now somehow in Grayson's hands. "Like I said," Grayson's voice was still quiet, still calm. "Just some friendly advice. Take it or don't, but choose carefully." In a dimly lit corner of the Broken Spoke Saloon, Snake nursed his bruised wrist and wounded pride with cheap whiskey. while Raven brooded beside him. The humiliation of their encounter with Grayson burned hotter than the rot gut in their glasses. Around them, the usual evening crowd kept their distance, sensing the dangerous mood that radiated from the two rustlers like heat from a prairie fire. "Nobody makes fools of us," Snake snarled, slamming his empty glass on the scarred wooden table. "Nobody. That peaceful rancher act of his, there's something he ain't telling us, Raven. No regular rancher moves like that." His fingers traced the tender spots on his wrist, remembering how easily Grayson had disarmed him. Raven leaned forward, his scarred face twisted in a grimace. "We've taken down bigger spreads than his. Meaner men, too. Remember that rancher up in Montana? The one with all them hired guns?" A cruel smile spread across his face. "Didn't help him when his barn went up in flames." Snake's eyes lit up with malicious intent. "Barn burning is just the start. I'm thinking we take everything. His cattle, his horses." He paused, pouring another drink. "His life, if he's fool enough to resist again. But slow-like. Make an example of him." They spent the next hour plotting their revenge, their voices low and vicious. Snake sketched a rough map of Grayson's ranch on the table with spilled whiskey, marking points of attack. They would need more men, more firepower. A message had already been sent to some former partners, hard men who wouldn't ask questions as long as the pay was good. "We'll hit him at sunset tomorrow," Snake decided, his cold eyes gleaming. "Start with the barn. When he runs out to save his precious horses, we'll have men waiting. Then we'll take our time with the cattle drive, might even use his own barn smoke as cover." Raven pulled out his knife, testing its edge against his thumb. "What about him?" "Him?" Snake's laugh was hollow and mean. "We'll teach him what happens when someone crosses the snake and the raven. Ain't nobody ever lived to tell about that lesson." He stood up, steadying himself against the table. "Get the supplies ready. I want enough oil to make sure that barn burns hot and fast." As they walked out of the saloon, their boots leaving dusty prints on the wooden floor, the other patrons breathed a collective sigh of relief. But one man in the corner, a traveling peddler who'd been quietly nursing his beer, slipped out shortly after them. He had a long ride ahead of him. Grayson's ranch was a good hour away, and someone needed to warn him about what was coming. Neither Snake nor Raven noticed the peddler's departure. They were too consumed with their plans for revenge, too blinded by their rage to consider that they might be underestimating their opponent once again. They had faced resistance before, dealt with tough men who thought they could stand against them. But they had never encountered someone like Grayson, a man who had learned his trade in places far deadlier than the Western Territories. The night grew deeper as they gathered their supplies, their hearts as black as the moonless sky above, unaware that they were about to wake a sleeping giant. The peddler's warning reached Grayson just before dawn. He listened quietly, thanked the man, and watched him ride away into the lightening sky. Then, for the first time in years, Grayson walked to the heavy trunk beneath his bed. His movements were deliberate, almost reverent, as he lifted the lid. The scent of gun oil and memories wafted up from the opened trunk. Inside lay the tools of his former trade, the custom Sharps rifle that had earned him his nickname, the spotter's scope that had helped him make impossible shots, and the worn leather journal filled with calculations for wind and distance. His fingers traced the rifle's familiar stock, memories flooding back with each touch. "Thought I'd left this life behind," he murmured to himself, lifting the weapon. The weight felt familiar, like greeting an old friend. He remembered the days when this rifle had been an extension of his arm, when his reputation as Deadeye had struck fear into the hearts of men across the frontier. A flash of memory hit him. The last time he'd used these skills, the mission that had made him walk away. He'd seen too much death, caused too much of it. He'd come to this quiet ranch seeking peace, hoping to never again have to rely on his deadly accuracy. But now, as he cleaned and checked the rifle with practiced efficiency, he knew that peace had been an illusion. The world had a way of finding men like him, no matter how far they ran. The difference was, this time he was protecting something that mattered: his home, his life, the peace he'd built here. For the next several hours, Grayson worked methodically around his property. He set up defensive positions, carefully concealed to look like natural features of the landscape. Root cellars became sniper nests. Hay bales were positioned to provide cover, and careful arrangements of rope and pulleys were hidden throughout the barn. Not looking to kill anyone, he reminded himself as he worked, setting triggers that would create distractions rather than deadly traps. His military training had taught him that sometimes the best way to win a fight was to avoid it altogether. By midday, the ranch looked exactly the same to casual observers, but Grayson had transformed it into a carefully planned battlefield. He'd used every trick he'd learned in his years as a scout, ways to channel movement, create confusion, and maintain the advantage even against superior numbers. As the sun began its westward descent, Grayson stood on his porch one last time, surveying his work. The rifle rested against the wall behind him, cleaned and loaded, but hopefully unnecessary. His eyes traced the familiar paths around his ranch, now subtly altered to work in his favor. "Last chance to walk away," he said softly, though he knew Snake and Raven wouldn't take it. Men like that only understood one language, the language of force. He'd tried to warn them, tried to avoid this confrontation. Now he would have to show them why the name Deadeye had once been whispered around campfires with awe and fear. The sun continued its slow descent, painting the sky in shades of orange and red. Somewhere out there, Snake and Raven were gathering their men, preparing for what they thought would be an easy raid. They were about to learn a harsh lesson about judging a man by his peaceful nature. The attack began just as the last light faded from the sky. Snake and Raven, leading a group of 6 hired guns, approached Grayson's ranch from different directions. Their confidence was palpable as they moved through the darkness, expecting to find a sleeping ranch and an unprepared rancher. The first sign that something was wrong came when one of their men triggered a hidden rope. Suddenly, a cascade of metal pots and pans crashed down from the barn rafters, the noise shattering the night's silence. Horses whinnied in panic, and cattle began to stir restlessly in their pens. "Spread out!" Snake hissed, fury evident in his voice. "Find him!" But spreading out was exactly what Grayson had planned for. As the raiders separated, each man found himself facing clever obstacles. One stepped into a shallow pit disguised with branches. Another got tangled in a carefully placed wire. Nothing lethal, but each trap slowed them down, confused them, and made them waste precious time and energy. "This ain't right," Raven muttered, his earlier confidence evaporating. "He was ready for us." A shot rang out, precise and controlled. One of their men yelped as his gun went flying from his hand, the bullet having struck it perfectly without causing injury. Before anyone could locate the shooter, another shot disarmed a second man just as cleanly. Snake, enraged by the resistance, decided to escalate. "Burn it!" he shouted, throwing a lit torch toward the barn. "Burn it all down!" The torch arced through the air, but before it could land, a shot rang out. The torch exploded in midair, scattered embers harmlessly across the dirt. The precision of the shot left everyone stunned. "That's enough," Grayson's voice carried across the yard, calm and steady. He emerged from the shadows, rifle held ready, but not aimed directly at anyone. "Last warning, leave now, or the next shots won't be so gentle." Snake, consumed by rage and humiliation, drew his pistol. "Kill him!" But before he could aim, another shot rang out. Snake's gun fell to pieces in his hand, its barrel split perfectly down the middle. 2 more shots in rapid succession, and Raven's weapon, along with other hired guns, were similarly destroyed. The remaining men, witnessing shooting skills they'd only heard about in legends, began backing away. They'd been hired for a simple raid, not to face whatever this was. "This is impossible," Raven whispered, staring at his ruined weapon. Grayson stepped fully into view now, his rifle held casually but ready. "Nothing is impossible about it. Just years of practice and a good eye. Now I believe we're done here." The hired guns, those who could still walk without limping from the traps they'd triggered, didn't need to be told twice. They fled into the darkness, leaving Snake and Raven standing alone, disarmed and disgraced. "Who are you?" Snake demanded, his voice trembling with a mixture of fear and rage. Grayson's reply was quiet but carried clearly across the yard. "Just a rancher who wants to be left in peace. But you boys wouldn't take that for an answer, would you?" The night air grew heavy with tension as Snake and Raven stood frozen, their weapons destroyed, their men scattered to the winds. In the moonlight, they watched as Grayson moved with the fluid grace of a mountain lion, his rifle held with the familiarity of an old friend. "I know who you are now," Snake said, his voice barely above a whisper. "They used to talk about you around campfires. Deadeye Blackwood, the scout who could hit a playing card edge on at 300 yards. The man who single-handedly stopped the Marshall Creek massacre." Grayson's expression remained unchanged, but his eyes held a distant look, as if seeing something far beyond the ranch yard. "That was another life," he said quietly. "One I left behind for good reasons." The memories flooded back, sharp and clear as crystal. The missions that had taken him deep into hostile territory, the lives he'd taken with surgical precision, the weight of responsibility that came with being the best at dealing death from a distance. He remembered the last shot he'd ever taken in service, a shot that had saved dozens of lives but had cost him a piece of his soul. "They said you disappeared," Raven spoke up, his usual bravado replaced by a mixture of awe and fear. "Said you got tired of killing." "Not tired," Grayson corrected him. "Just realized there had to be more to life than taking it from others. Came out here looking for peace." His voice hardened slightly. "And I found it, until you boys decided to disturb it." Snake, despite his fear, couldn't help but laugh bitterly. "Peace? The deadliest shot in the territories becomes a cattle rancher? That's rich." "Being good at killing doesn't mean you have to love it," Grayson replied, his words carrying the weight of hard-earned wisdom. "Every man gets to choose who he wants to be. I made my choice." As if to emphasize his point, Grayson slowly lowered his rifle, though both rustlers knew he could raise and fire it faster than they could blink. "That's why you're both still breathing. The old me wouldn't have bothered with warning shots." The significance of this statement wasn't lost on either man. They'd heard stories of Deadeye's accuracy, how he could place a bullet wherever he wanted with almost supernatural precision. He could have killed them a dozen times over during their failed raid. "So what now?" Snake asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "Now you leave," Grayson said simply. "Leave and spread the word this ranch is off limits. And if you're smart, you'll find a new line of work. One that doesn't involve taking what belongs to others." The rustlers backed away slowly, their confidence shattered, their reputation in tatters. They had come expecting to find an easy target, a soft rancher they could intimidate and rob. Instead, they had found a legend, a man whose mercy was perhaps more terrifying than his ability to kill. As they disappeared into the darkness, Grayson remained standing in his yard, his rifle now cradled in his arms like a sleeping child. He knew this wasn't over. Men like Snake and Raven had too much pride to let such a humiliation go unanswered. The next morning found Grayson riding into town, the streets still quiet in the early dawn light. He tied his horse outside the sheriff's office, pausing briefly to straighten his worn leather vest. Inside, Sheriff Eli Mercer was already at his desk, a cup of coffee cooling beside him as he sorted through wanted posters. "Well, if it ain't the ghost himself," Eli said without looking up. "Wondered how long you'd stay hidden, John." The use of Grayson's old first name hung in the air between them, a reminder of their shared past. "Wasn't trying to hide, Eli," Grayson replied, settling into a chair. "Just trying to live quietly." He paused, studying his old friend's face. "But trouble has a way of finding us, doesn't it?" Eli finally looked up, his weathered face breaking into a knowing smile. "Heard about last night. Word travels fast. Snake and Raven skulked through town like beaten dogs, gathering what men they could find." His expression turned serious. "They're not done, John. Not by a long shot." "I know," Grayson said quietly. "That's why I'm here." As they talked, people began filtering into the sheriff's office. First came old Tom from the general store, then Marcus, the blacksmith, and finally Sarah from the saloon. Each had their own story about Snake and Raven's cruelty, about stolen property and threatened violence. "They've been terrorizing folks up and down the territory," Eli explained, spreading a map across his desk, "using each town as a base to hit isolated ranches, but nobody stood up to them like you did." The small crowd murmured in agreement. Some had heard whispers about Grayson's true identity, while others just saw him as the quiet rancher who'd finally pushed back against the Rustlers' tyranny. "We're with you," Marcus declared. His massive arms crossed over his chest. "Whatever you need. Ain't right, letting men like that run roughshod over honest folks." Grayson looked around the room, seeing determination in every face. These weren't soldiers or gunfighters. They were shopkeepers, farmers, ordinary people who'd had enough of living in fear. "It won't be easy," he warned them. "Snake and Raven will come back stronger, more desperate. They can't let this challenge go unanswered." "Then let them come," Sarah spoke up, her voice firm. "We'll show them what happens when a community stands together." Eli stood, strapping on his gun belt. "Just like old times, eh, John? You picking the shots, me keeping the peace?" Grayson allowed himself a small smile. "Different this time, Eli. We're not fighting for some general strategy. We're fighting for our homes, our way of life." As they began planning defenses and organizing watches, Grayson felt a familiar tension in his chest. He'd come to this town seeking peace, trying to escape his past. Instead, he'd found something worth fighting for, not just his own ranch, but a community of good people who deserved to live without fear. The sun climbed higher in the sky as they worked, casting long shadows through the office windows. In those shadows, the legend of Deadeye was being reborn, but this time as a protector rather than a killer. The attack came 3 days later, just as the sun began to sink below the horizon. Snake and Raven had gathered nearly 20 men, a motley crew of outlaws and hired guns, drawn by promises of easy riches and the chance to take down a legend. They approached Grayson's ranch from all directions, their horses' hooves kicking up clouds of dust that glowed orange in the fading light. "Remember," Snake called out to his men, his voice carrying across the open ground, "we ain't leaving until that ranch is burned and Deadeye's reputation is buried with him." But as they drew closer, they realized something was different. The ranch wasn't the vulnerable target they'd expected. Armed townspeople were positioned strategically around the property, their rifles glinting in the dying sunlight. Sheriff Eli stood on the porch beside Grayson, both men radiating a calm confidence that made several of the outlaws shift uneasily in their saddles. "Last chance to ride away?" Grayson's voice carried clearly across the yard. "Nobody has to die here today." Raven sneered, trying to mask his uncertainty. 20 against what? A handful of shopkeepers and farmers? You're outnumbered, Deadeye." "Numbers ain't everything," Eli replied, his hand resting casually on his gun belt. "Quality tends to beat quantity." Snake raised his arm, preparing to signal the attack, but before he could bring it down, a shot rang out. His hat flew off his head, a neat hole punched through its crown. The precision of the shot sent a clear message. Grayson could have easily put that bullet through his skull. "That's your last warning," Grayson called out, his rifle still smoking. "Next one won't be so friendly." Several of the hired guns began backing their horses away, suddenly questioning their commitment to this fight. They'd been told they were up against one skilled shooter, not an organized resistance led by a legendary marksman. "Cowards!" Snake spat, drawing his pistol. "Rush them! They can't shoot all of us!" The battle erupted in a chaos of gunfire and shouts. But where the Rustlers' shots were wild and desperate, Grayson's allies fired with discipline and purpose, just as he'd taught them. His own shots rang out with surgical precision, disarming outlaws without killing them, turning their weapons into useless scrap with carefully placed bullets. Marcus the blacksmith proved particularly effective, his powerful arms handling a shotgun like it was a toy. Sarah from the saloon showed she was as good with a rifle as she was with serving drinks, while old Tom demonstrated that age hadn't dimmed his aim. "This ain't what you promised," one of the hired guns shouted at Snake as he clutched his shot-away gun belt. "You said this would be easy." The Rustlers' formation began to break apart as more men fell back, their confidence shattered by the organized defense. They'd expected to find a single rancher, perhaps with a few allies. Instead, they'd run headlong into a community united against them, led by a man whose skills had only grown sharper with time. The firefight intensified as Snake and Raven, realizing their advantage of numbers was slipping away, pushed their remaining men into increasingly desperate attacks. Bullets whizzed through the air, kicking up dust and splintering wood. But Grayson's careful planning began to show its true worth. Every time the Rustlers tried to advance, they found themselves caught in crossfire from hidden positions. When they attempted to flank the defenders, they ran into carefully placed barriers that forced them into killing zones. Grayson's shots continued to ring out with deadly precision, each one finding its mark with surgical accuracy. "Circle around the barn!" Snake screamed, his face contorted with rage. "Burn them out!" 3 men broke away, making a dash for the barn with lit torches. Grayson's rifle spoke 3 times in rapid succession. The torches exploded in their hands, sending them scrambling for cover. Before they could regroup, Marcus emerged from behind a water trough, his shotgun convincing them to retreat. "You're fighting a losing battle, Snake," Eli called out, his voice carrying over the gunfire. "Look around you, half your men are already gone." He was right. The Rustlers' numbers had dwindled significantly. Some lay wounded but alive, their weapons destroyed by Grayson's precise shots. Others had simply fled, deciding that no payment was worth facing such skilled opposition. Sarah's voice suddenly rang out from her position near the corral. "More riders coming from the east!" For a moment, both sides paused, turning to look. Through the dust and smoke, a group of horsemen appeared, riding hard toward the ranch. Snake's face lit up with cruel hope. He'd sent for additional reinforcements before the attack, but as the riders drew closer, his expression fell. These weren't the hardened outlaws he'd been expecting. Instead, it was a group of ranchers from neighboring properties, led by the peddler who'd warned Grayson days before. They'd heard the gunfire and come to help their neighbor. "Looks like the odds just shifted again," Grayson said quietly, chambering another round. The arrival of fresh allies broke what remained of the Rustlers' morale. Several more threw down their weapons, raising their hands in surrender. Others turned their horses and fled into the gathering darkness, leaving Snake and Raven increasingly isolated. "This ends now," Grayson declared, stepping out into the open. His rifle held ready but not aimed. "You've lost your men, lost your advantage, lost everything. Surrender and you'll face a fair trial." Snake's response was a wild shot in Grayson's direction. But before the bullet had traveled halfway, Grayson's rifle cracked. Snake's gun flew from his hand, split clean down the middle just like before. Raven, seeing his partner disarmed and their plans in ruins, made one last desperate attempt. He drew a hidden derringer from his boot, but Grayson was faster. 2 rapid shots rang out. One knocked the small gun away. The other severed Raven's gun belt, sending it dropping to the dust. The battle was effectively over. What had started as an overwhelming force of outlaws had been reduced to 2 disarmed leaders, surrounded by the very community they'd thought to terrorize. In the tense silence that followed the battle, Snake and Raven stood disarmed and defiant, their backs against the barn wall, surrounded by the very people they'd terrorized for so long. The setting sun cast long shadows across the ranch yard, painting everything in shades of gold and crimson. "You still won't kill us, will you, Deadeye?" Snake spat the name like a curse. "Even after everything, you're still playing at being peaceful." His eyes darted around, looking for any chance of escape, but finding none. Every angle was covered, every route blocked. Grayson stepped forward, his rifle held casually but ready. "You still don't understand," he said, his voice carrying the weight of years of experience. Killing isn't strength. Any fool with a gun can kill. The real strength is in knowing when not to. Pretty words, Raven sneered, though fear flickered in his eyes. But that's not what they said about you during the war. They said you could kill a man at 1,000 yards, said you never missed, never showed mercy. I was a different man then, Grayson replied quietly. War changes you, makes you hard, but peace? He gestured to the townspeople around them. Peace changes you too, makes you understand what's worth fighting for. Snake laughed, a harsh, desperate sound. Worth fighting for? These sheep? These weak townspeople who needed you to protect them? These people, Grayson's voice hardened slightly, stood up to you when no one else would. They're not weak. They just needed to be reminded of their strength. Eli stepped forward, handcuffs gleaming in the fading light. It's over, boys. Time to face justice for what you've done. Something shifted in Snake's eyes, a dangerous, cornered look. With lightning speed, he reached into his boot and pulled out a small knife. Not yet, it ain't! He lunged forward, the blade flashing toward Grayson's throat. 2 shots rang out in rapid succession. The knife flew from Snake's hand, cut cleanly in 2 pieces. His boot heel exploded, sending him sprawling face first in the dirt. Grayson hadn't even seemed to aim. Like I said, Grayson stated calmly, smoke still curling from his rifle barrel. Any fool can kill. The trick is knowing how to stop someone without taking their life. Raven, watching his partner groaning in the dust, finally slumped in defeat. You could have killed us 12 times over, he said, the realization finally hitting him. More than that, Grayson agreed. Every shot, from the first warning to the last, was exactly where I wanted it. Because these people? He nodded to the townspeople around them. They needed to see that strength doesn't mean cruelty, that justice doesn't always need to end in death. As Eli moved to handcuff the defeated Rustlers, the gathered townspeople began to understand what they'd witnessed. This wasn't just a victory over a gang of outlaws. It was a lesson in the true meaning of strength, taught by a man who had mastered both the dealing and the sparing of life. The following days brought a flurry of activity to the usually quiet town. Sheriff Eli's jail was filled to capacity with captured rustlers, while riders spread the news of Snake and Raven's defeat across the territory. The story grew with each telling, how a peaceful rancher had revealed himself to be the legendary Deadeye, how he'd united a community to stand against tyranny. At the courthouse, the trial proceeded swiftly. Victim after victim came forward, testifying about the rustlers' crimes. Snake and Raven sat in sullen silence as the evidence mounted against them. Their reputation for invincibility had been shattered, replaced by the humiliation of being outsmarted and outshot by the very kind of man they dismissed as weak. 20 years hard labor, the judge pronounced, his gavel echoing through the packed courtroom, for rustling, attempted murder, and terrorizing peaceful citizens. He peered down at the condemned men. You're fortunate Mr. Blackwood believed in mercy. A few years ago, men like you would have faced the rope. As the prisoners were led away, Grayson stood quietly at the back of the courtroom. Sarah from the saloon approached him, a warm smile on her face. Town won't be the same now, she said. People walk taller, stand straighter. Your example showed them they don't have to live in fear. Outside, the street was bustling with activity. Marcus had reopened his blacksmith shop, the rhythmic ringing of his hammer filling the air. Old Tom's General Store had new customers from neighboring towns, drawn by tales of the community that had stood up to the rustlers. Never thought I'd see the day, Eli mused, joining Grayson on the courthouse steps. Whole territory's changing. Other towns are organizing, standing up to outlaws. Your story's spreading like wildfire. Grayson nodded, watching the townspeople go about their business. Children played freely in the streets now, no longer hurried inside at the sound of approaching horses. Ranchers chatted openly on street corners, their rifles remaining holstered on their saddles. It's not my story, Grayson replied quietly. It's theirs. They just needed someone to remind them of their own strength. Later that afternoon, as Grayson prepared to ride back to his ranch, a group of townspeople gathered to see him off. They brought gifts: fresh baked bread from the baker's wife, a new saddle blanket from Marcus, even a bottle of fine whiskey from Sarah's saloon. "You'll always have friends here," Eli said, gripping Grayson's hand firmly. "And allies, if you ever need them again." Grayson mounted his horse, looking out over the faces of people who had become more than just neighbors. They were partners in something greater: the transformation of a territory from a place of fear to one of justice and community. "Keep up the watches," he advised them. "Stay strong together. That's what really defeated Snake and Raven. Not my shooting, but your unity." As he rode away, the setting sun at his back, Grayson felt a peace deeper than any he'd known before. He had found what he'd been searching for all along: not just a quiet life, but a purpose worthy of his skills. Word of what happened at Grayson's ranch spread across the territory like a prairie fire, growing into a legend that would be told around campfires for generations. But unlike the old stories of Deadeye, the deadly army scout, these tales spoke of a different kind of hero, one who used his skills to protect rather than destroy. One crisp morning, about a month after the battle, Grayson stood in his yard with Tommy, the blacksmith's 10-year-old son. The boy held a small training rifle carefully crafted by his father, while Grayson patiently explained the fundamentals of marksmanship. "It's not about how fast you can shoot," Grayson told him, adjusting the boy's stance. "It's about responsibility, understanding that every shot has consequences. That's what makes a true marksman." The boy nodded solemnly, taking the lesson to heart. Other children from town had started coming too, their parents now seeing the value in learning from a man who understood both the power and the restraint of wielding a weapon. Sheriff Eli often visited, bringing news from around the territory. Other communities had started following their example, organizing themselves against outlaws. The days of ruthless gangs terrorizing isolated ranches were fading, replaced by a new era of cooperation and mutual protection. "You started something bigger than yourself," Eli told him one evening as they sat on Grayson's porch. "People aren't just learning to shoot, they're learning to stand together." Grayson's ranch had become something of a gathering place. Ranchers would stop by to discuss security measures. Townspeople would bring news and supplies, and everyone felt welcome. The isolation he had once sought had been replaced by a sense of community he hadn't known he needed. "You know what's funny?" Sarah said during one such gathering. "Snake and Raven thought they were strong because they could frighten people. Turns out real strength was in bringing people together." As the years passed, Grayson's legend evolved. Children would point him out in town, whispering about his incredible shots during the battle, but their parents would tell them about his wisdom, his restraint, and his dedication to peace. He remained the quiet rancher he'd always been, but now his silence carried a different weight, that of a man who had found his true purpose. "Tell us again about the battle, Mr. Blackwood," children would beg when he came to town for supplies. And sometimes, if the mood was right, he would share not tales of gunfights and glory, but lessons about courage, community, and the true meaning of strength. His story became more than just another frontier legend. It became a testament to the power of redemption and the importance of using one's skills for the good of others. If you enjoyed this incredible story of redemption and justice, don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel for more amazing tales from the frontier.